Hang on. All right. So tonight we are discussing the age of the universe. Jeff did ask me before whether it's the age of the world, the sun, the earth, but we will be talking about the age of the universe and what Judaism believes and what science tells us and whether they are consistent. Now, sorry, just give me 1 second because Harry's calling. Hello? Hi, can you not get on? Did you get my email yesterday? So we're talking about the age of the universe, and Harry's here. Hi, Harry. So the age of the universe and what science believes or tells us what Judaism believes and whether they are disconnected or they're connected or they're consistent. Now, as I said before, I'm not a scientist. We do have a few scientists on the call, and I'm sure they'll jump in if I say something wrong, and I welcome you to do that. That's fine, because I don't pretend to know all the science. What I'm going to do is actually go through the different commentaries about Bereshit, the creation of the world, and I'll discuss a bit of what the science thinks, and we can discuss how they fit in. Now, interestingly, there's two types of commentaries. There's the ancient commentaries, and then there's the modern commentaries. Now, a lot of the modern commentaries, obviously because of the current science, try to make it so it fits into the science, because we never like to be wrong, right? We never like to be wrong. And therefore, sometimes we'll bend the interpretations to make sure we don't sound silly. So when Jeff comes on the call and says, your Torah's, no, not that he would say this, but a guy like Jeff, who might say the Torah's wrong, the science is right, we can say, oh no, it means this or means that. That's the modern commentaries. But the ancient commentaries actually predate all the science. So we can actually refer to those as well, just to show you that we're not making this up as we go along. The Torah's opinion was there from the beginning, and then we'll see if it marries up. Now, I'm gonna share with you about 7 different approaches to the age of the universe from the rabbi's perspective. The last one I'll share with you is a guy called Dr. Schroeder, who's actually famous in this area. He's a proper physicist. He worked for, I don't know, NASA. I don't know where he worked. You can look him up. You can Google him. And he gives a very fascinating explanation of how the science actually fits perfectly with the Torah's perspective. And we'll do that last because I found that the most fascinating. But he's written books, and when you read his books, he's got all the numbers. So Judy and Jeff, you can go back and actually look through his calculations. Don't take my word for it. But you'll have to buy his book. I don't have it. But I will give you other approaches as well because they're all very interesting. But what's interesting is when Dr. Schroeder looks at his work, he actually only uses ancient commentaries. So he doesn't use the commentaries that might have bent the interpretation to science. He uses ones that predate the science. Secondly, when we talk about the age of the universe, and this is very important, we're talking about the age of the universe from our perspective, from the way we measure the universe going back to the Big Bang or whatever you want to call it, the creation, as opposed to some other type of science. So when we say the world is 13 billion or 15 billion, whatever the number is, we're talking about how we measure it from our perspective today using our time. Now, the third thing is there is lots of information, and I'm just going to give you some different approaches to it. In the Torah, and we've learnt this before in our shiurim, there's 72 ways to interpret everything. Right, that's the minimum number. And that doesn't mean they're all right or wrong. Sometimes they're a bit deeper, sometimes they're a bit esoteric, sometimes they're plain meaning. They're all right in their own way, right? We never disagree about the fundamentals, right? In other words, we know God created the world, whatever he created, but the interpretation might be slightly different depending on how you look at it. Finally, and this is really important, this is a very important piece of information. We have 13 principles of faith. For example, we believe there's one God. We believe in the Messiah. We believe in resurrection of the dead. We believe that Moses gave us the Torah on Mount Sinai. We believe there's 5 books. We believe the Torah doesn't change, right? Out of those 13, reward and punishment, which we did a few weeks ago. Out of those 13, there is not one that says, I believe that the world is 5,781 years old. It is not one of our fundamental beliefs. And therefore, if you come away tonight going, I think the world is still 15 billion years old, or I think it's 13, or I think it's 5,000, it doesn't matter to us because it's not one of our beliefs. you can walk around out today, and hopefully what you'll do is, and I'm going to share with you the material as well, right? You can go away, read more about it, and form your own approach, what you'd like to do. But whatever you come up with is not a fundamental approach. If the science suddenly tells us that the calendar is really 15 billion years old, it's not going to ruin my religion because it's not one of the fundamentals, okay? And I'll explain that a bit more, because what we're actually going to discuss tonight is that we actually have two calendars. The first calendar is 5,781 years, right? Which is from Rosh Hashanah, and when the world was created, which is actually day 6 of creation. It's from Adam. Sorry, from Adam, right? There is another 6 days prior to Adam, which has its own separate calendar. So when I say the birthday of the world is 5,781, we're talking about from the creation of Adam. And we will talk about that more as well, okay? So there's actually two parts of the calendar. There's a 6 days of creation, and then there's a day from when Adam was born and onwards, and I'll explain that in a moment, because we actually say that every day in our prayers, and we talk about it all the time. So I just want to get that out of the way in case, and if you want to hang up now, that's fine, but hopefully that was enough to intrigue you to stay on. Okay, now I'm going to share with you, I'm going to share my screen, because I'm going to actually lead you through a bunch of source sheets, which were prepared by our very own Ronnie Figdor, who at one stage of his life obviously had a lot of time on his hands before he was a CEO, and put together lots of very useful information. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. So that's Genesis. Now, you can see my screen, right? You can see and a document coming up. Okay, so it's a bit slow. So Judy, you put your hand up so I know you can see it. Now these are Ronnie's sheets, and if you're happy to, I'm happy to share with you this afterwards so you can read it. The highlights are my own highlights. So I'm just going to show you the key bits in each part of the articles, because we don't have time to read through it all, and it's for your own reading if you want. But this, firstly, I think we start off with Rabbi, I think he's a rabbi from Zamir Cohen. It's from an organization called Hidabrut. Hidabrut is actually a really great website. You can go there, and there's brilliant lectures on every topic. It's a really, really good website. So if you want to go do that after, they actually get these amazing speakers, and they talk about different topics. So it's called Hidabrut. But this is from Zamir Cohen, who I think does a lot of talks around the age of the universe, Big Bang, creation, evolution, all those types of things, and you can look him up afterwards. But he gives a bit of a history as to, I guess, where the science of the age of the universe started. And Jeff and Judy, if you want to jump in, you can. But I think what in the ancient sort of scientific commentators, like the Greek philosophers, they always thought that the world was not created. It always existed. It was called the steady state theory, right? And this all changed in modern thinking in the 1900s. But until that time, it was always believed that the world just always existed. I don't know how they thought that. I'm not really sure, but that's what they thought. Now, obviously, the fact that the world always existed is completely against Torah, the Torah, because the Torah says God created the world, right? So all these scientists for hundreds of years, right, or thousands of years, told us that the world always existed. And our Torah always said the world was created, and we were always at loggerheads with the science, but that's just how it is, because we believe in our Torah, the world was created. But the first challenge came in 1924 with Edward Hubble and his Hubble telescope. And he made two discoveries, which I've highlighted here. And Jeff, you were mentioning this before, and I don't know if you want to add something after I mention this, but basically, he firstly discovered that actually the universe extends for millions of galaxies, right? It wasn't just a current state. The Milky Way, which we live in, is just
billions of galaxies.
Millions?
Oh, yeah. Billions.
Billions. Okay. Well, he says millions. I say billions. Sounds good. And we're just one tiny speck in this huge amount of galaxies. The second thing was, he said that we are actually not in a state of like we are what we are, a current state. We're actually expanding, and we keep expanding and expanding. And then we talk about time warps and time bending and all that type of thing. But the fact is, the universe gets bigger and bigger and bigger every single day, like an inflating balloon, he calls it. So that's very important. Now, Then we had in 65, we had Wilson and Penzias, the American scientists, who detected this radiation, this warmth, this glow, which basically provided proof for the Big Bang theory, which is what scientists currently think, which is the world started from a Big Bang, started with a little atom or whatever the word is. I'm not a scientist, I'm just using everyday words. And there was an explosion and the universe expanded from that on. And before these guys found this, radiation and this sort of heat, they couldn't really explain how the Big Bang worked. But because of sort of their understanding of it, we realized it could be the Big Bang is actually true. And that is, was this huge sort of energy source, and it started cooling over the years. And that's how they could sort of capture this radiation billions of years later of this warmth of the world. But the point is, and even whether it's the Big Bang or not the Big Bang, what's interesting is that it sort of got rid of that whole old method of the world was in its current state, a steady state, and actually was created. Now, the scientists aren't going to tell you that the world was created from God. They'll probably tell you we don't know how the Big Bang started. Is that right, Jeff? They don't know how it started. But the fact is it started from a little tiny speck and blew up, Big Bang, and created the universe. So we as Jews would say God created it. Scientists would say we don't know. There's no explanation, whatever they would say. But no matter where you got from that Big Bang, the fact is it's actually more consistent with our Torah knowledge than the old theory. And that is that the world's sort of expanding and it was created, from nothing to something. That is how we believe it. So the beginning of the Bereshit says the world was null and void and Hashem created something. He created something from nothing. And that's what the Big Bang's all about. Now, that's Article 1. That's Article 1. And I just think it's nice to know that even though the Torah didn't change its theory, even though for hundreds of years, the philosophers told us that the world was in a steady state. And I think that's really important because our Torah does not change, right? Whatever we believe was given by God, it doesn't change. Whether the science comes along with us or not, that's nice to have, but we don't need the science. But when it does marry up, we're even happier, right? We're even happier. Now, this article here, and I said I'll share this later with you, just talks about the different ways scientists over the years have measured the age of the universe. And I think, and this is just a couple of ones. So there was Lord Kelvin. Is that how they got the Kelvin heating? Did he create that, or was that a different guy? But he basically, in 1862, yeah, same guy. So he decided that the world was between 20 million and 400 million years. Then Darwin's advocate, Huxley, came up with some other calculations, and he didn't like the Kelvin's calculations. He came up with his own, and he came up with something about 20 to 40 million years old, whatever it was. Then there was in John Joly of the Trinity College, used a salt erosion. Then we had the theory of evolution, because when you looked at evolution, the way they believed in evolution, they realized that the world must be bigger, older than 100 million years old to get evolution happening. So they started talking about 3 billion years. And then we had something called radiometric aging. Jeff, can you tell us about this? What's radiometric aging? Is this to do with rocks?
Look for a certain isotope of carbon
Right.
In any material, rocks, trees, anything at all. They look for a certain isotope of carbon and they know what its decay rate is. So they measure how much is there and they can determine then how old is the sample. Okay,
excellent. And basically, tell me if I'm wrong, but they calculated based on that the Earth is about 4 or 5 billion years old, not the universe, the Earth, using the radiometric aging methodology. So that's the science. And obviously, people who are scientists study this in more detail, but we've only got 2 minutes. So that's a very quick summary of the science. But the point is that the Earth or the universe is billions of years old, according to the current science, not 5,000 years old, which is what our calendar is. But that's okay. We've only just started. Now, we're going to use the term, and this is how Ronnie puts on his paper, called reconciliations. And there's about 5 or 6 approaches to reconciling the science, which says the Earth is 13 billion years old. The Earth is 5 billion, the universe is 15 billion, and the way we look at the world. Now, these are just different approaches to it. There's not one right or wrong way, but I think it's really interesting to see how the rabbis have discussed the universe. Now, a lot of these, for example, we're going to quote the Talmud now, was way before the current science from 1924. Obviously, the Talmud was written in 500, the year 500. So it was probably written at the time when they decided that the Earth was in a steady state. It always existed. So these rabbis are probably writing at a time where they were probably even censored. And in fact, we know that the Talmud was censored many times and burnt in Italy. We know that was burnt a few times as part of the whatever they're called at those times. Forgot the word, historical word. Now, this is the first reconciliation. So as you can see my screen here. It says here that the world was, this is from Rosh Hashanah, by the way, the Talmud. Rabbi Schroeder Levi says, the world was created fully mature. In other words, when God created the world, he didn't just create a world that was like brand new. There wasn't like seeds in the ground and, that started growing into trees. He created trees that already existed. So he created a world that was already fully mature. And I guess that's all the Talmud says, by the way. It doesn't go on to science and Big Bang and anything like that. It just says the world was created fully mature. And I guess what we can glean from that is that when Hashem created the world, it was already an old world. Now, whether that was 1,000 years or 5 billion years, it doesn't matter. It was an old world. And therefore, when the scientists today measure rock, they're measuring rocks that are, maybe they are 5 billion years old, but actually Hashem put them there as a mature world. So that's it. That's just one interpretation. Okay. And obviously, anyone who's a scientist will have a leap of faith going, well, you have to assume God created the world, but that's just one way of looking at it. And in fact, it's a very easy way. I don't want to say a cop-out. It's not a cop-out. It's an actual interpretation. We're saying the world was created mature. And therefore, what we're measuring today is actually 5 billion years old. It's just it was created that way. Now, the next one is a similar idea. And this is from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Now, he was actually a scientist. He studied physics, I think, in university. Doesn't mean he was an expert in the Big Bang Theory, but he just put this in one of his talks. He said two things. He said, firstly, number A, and that is the conditions that existed in prehistoric times, like the atmospheric pressures, the temperatures, radioactivity, was all unknown, right? We don't know if what we're measuring today had the same theory behind it. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff or Judy, but even today, the radiometric testing, I assume that it's got assumptions built into it. And the assumptions are that the atmosphere is similar to what it was 15 billion years ago, and that's what they're using. So all he's saying is it's possible that there were different types of environment at the time, which could be a different answer. So one cannot exclude the possibility that dinosaurs existed 5,700 years ago and became fossilized under terrific natural cataclysms. In other words, well, not actually, it could be that dinosaurs did exist, right? But it could have happened 5,000 years ago and the whole sort of nature of the world changed. That's his opinion, okay? Secondly, and this is more to do with the one we just mentioned before, when God created the world, it's very possible he put in fossils and old bones and skeletons. Now, we don't know why he did that. I don't know why he did that. But the fact is, when he created a mature world, it's possible he put in some exciting things in there. Like he put in a prehistoric volcano that was already extinct. Or he put in some fossils just to make our life really interesting. We don't know why he did it, but he did it. And I guess the point is, why he created the fossil is no more a bigger question. When Hashem created the world, why did he put in atoms? Why did he have to make molecules? Why couldn't he just make a person? Why does the world have to be made of atoms? We don't know that. I don't know if science knows either. We just know that we exist through atoms. So that's just one way of explaining the world. The world was a mature world. Now, the second sort of reconciliation, right? Now, don't forget, we're not trying to reconcile science. We're just giving you the Torah's perspective. And remember, this was written again before the science. So we didn't write this to make the physicists of the world happy, right? We're not doing this so Jeff and Judy walk away going, oh, science and Torah are equal, right? This is pure Torah values, pure Torah knowledge. Now, this is extremely interesting, but a bit esoteric. Now, we know in the big Bereshit it says there was evening and there was morning, day one, right? Vayere, vayivoker, yom echad. Or vayere, vayivoker, yom sheni. Now, we also know, and this is, you have to remember this because it's really interesting. We know that it says there was evening, there was morning, day one. There was evening, there was morning, day two. There was evening, there was morning, day three. And then he created the sun and the moon. So the sun and the moon actually existed before there was evening and before there was morning. Has anyone ever thought about that before? So So the first verse of the Torah says there was evening and there was morning. Now, when we think of that, we go, oh yeah, there was evening, the sun went down. There was morning, the sun came up. Day one. But then it says in the fourth day that he created the sun and the moon. So how do you have morning and evening without the sun and the moon? Interesting question, right? Anyone ever thought about that or have an answer? Well, no one ever thought of it.
No.
So how do you have an evening and morning when the sun and the moon didn't exist till day 4? Okay. So this is how the Gemara, the Talmud, explains it. It says this proves that the Holy One, blessed is he, went on creating worlds and destroying them until he created this one. In other words, before this world existed, our current Earth, there were other worlds that existed before, prehistoric worlds, right? And then he created this one, right? And then he put the sun and the moon in, and then he says, by the way, and it was very good. Why did Hashem say it was very good, right? Why Hashem said this is good is because he created other ones before and didn't like them. Now, I don't know why he did that. We don't know either. But obviously he created, maybe didn't like the people in it. Maybe it was the wrong type of person. But when he got to our world, he says, oh, this is the world I want. We like this world with Kilda, Shule, right? And with the rabbis and Melbourne, right? We like all these things. This one's very good. He's going to keep it. So this Bereshit Rabbah, way before science, is telling us there were prehistoric worlds. Further, there's another text. This is from Rabbi Lipschitz, who's an expert in Torah and paleontology. So don't forget, there are many rabbis who have other careers, right? Most rabbis are lawyers. Some of them are scientists. Very rare, but you find them. Now, he's saying that actually this process repeated itself 7 times. And in fact, our whole world is in the process of one of these 7 times. In other words, the world gets created and destroyed 7 times until we get to the 7th year, which is Shemitah, right? The 7th year when we rest, almost like we have our 7 years. Now, he tells us, the Kabbalists tell us that we are actually in the 4th cycle of worlds being created and destroyed. In other words, before our world existed, there were 3 other worlds that existed and were destroyed. And we are now in the 4th one. And this is quite interesting because if you look at the science, the paleontologists, in fact, there were 4 eras before ours: the Precambrian, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, the Cenozoic, whatever they're called, right? We also know when you look at rocks, the Himalayas, wherever you are in the world, there are different layers of rocks, right? We also know that when the world was created, right? And I'll show you something interesting in a second. I'll stop sharing their screen because I'll show you something in my screen. So we're in the 4th cycle of worlds being created and destroyed. But let me just show you this. I've called this Talmud Shiur extras. Let me just get this open. Show you. So I'll show you the wording here. This is Bereshit. When God began to create the heaven and the earth, the earth was uniform. Oh, can you see my screen, by the way?
No.
No, sorry. Let me share my screen again. Oh, hello, Bruce. Didn't see you there.
Hello, Rabbi.
Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Bereshit bara Elokim. Everyone knows this. When God created the heavens and the earth was unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep. So we said before that the world was created from nothing, but in fact, the earth was unformed and void. How was the world unformed and void? Tohu vavohu. So according to this explanation, in fact, the world had been destroyed before. There was another world before ours. And basically, when you looked out, it was like a science fiction movie, just like, or maybe from Return of the Jedi, from Star Wars. You go to those planets and there's just all dark and like water, nothing happening. And it's all void. And suddenly Hashem creates our earth. So the world, it doesn't say here the world was nothing and created something. It says it was unformed and void. And perhaps that could be from the fact that our world, or the world before us, was destroyed, and we're left sort of with this void and unformed world, and Hashem created this one. That would explain, could be, obviously why there are things before us. Now, let me show you something else interesting. This is the first word of the Torah, Bereshit. Do you see that? Bereshit. Now, the first word of the Torah has 4 crowns, which is very rare on a bet. A bet usually has 2. But we have a custom on the first letter to put 4 crowns. Why do we put 4 crowns? Perhaps to tell us that we are in the 4th version of creation. There are 3 worlds before us that were destroyed. We are now the 4th one. Okay, could be. Now, I don't know if it's right or wrong, Jeff. I don't know. I'm just giving you the different opinions. Secondly, the second point is look at the world. The Torah starts with the word bet. Now, we know the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph. Why does the Torah start with the word bet? Perhaps to tell us that we are sort of like in our second life. You know, there were other worlds before, and we're now in the second life, and this is what we're starting. Also, the message of the bet, and this will come to later because Jarrod Schroeder tells us also, is look at the letter of the bet. The bet is showing you that we're only looking, Hebrew goes forward, right? So Hebrew from right to left is showing you we're only going to look forward from the bet. There was all these things before us, all this blank space on the parchment that we don't know about. We don't know what happened before this world. We are only looking forward, okay? Now, all that's telling us, by the way, is telling us that one explanation of this world is that there were maybe worlds before us. Could be we're in the 4th one. Could be there are other worlds. And therefore, when we measure the age of the universe, how far back are we measuring? Are we measuring from creation of our world? Or are we measuring even further back to other worlds as well? And were the mountains that existed, and we look down in mountain and we say the world is 5 billion years old, was that layer, the bottom layer of mountain, actually one of the original worlds that we don't know about? Or was it this current world? Okay. By the way, this is just one explanation. Okay. So just one way to look at it. All right. Now, let me just go back to my screen. So I'm going to share again because I want to take you back to what we were doing before, which is our Talmud shiur. So I'm jumping a bit, but I just thought that was really interesting, the fact that we have 4 bets. Okay, now we're up to the 3rd reconciliation. Now, we said before that the day 1, day 2, day 3 occurred without the sun and the moon, right? We also know that on day 1, it doesn't say Yom Rishon, like all the other days say Yom, like if you know Hebrew, right? Sunday's Yom Rishon. Monday's Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, Yom Revi'i, right? It's the first day, the second day, the third day, the 4th day of the week. Now we know that day 2 in the Torah is referred to as Yom Sheni, the 2nd day. Day 3 is the 3rd day. Yom Revi'i is the 4th day. But the first day of creation, it doesn't say Yom Rishon. What does it say? It says Yom Echad, day 1. It doesn't say the first day. It says day 1. And according to this rabbi, who is actually a very controversial rabbi. In fact, some of his ideas were banned from the normal rabbinical colleges for a while because he was just too smart for the average rabbi and they didn't like his ideas. But one of his ideas was actually that day 1 doesn't mean 24 hours. It just means a very, very long day, right? And don't forget, time didn't exist at that time because the sun and the moon were only created on day 4. So day 1 could be 5 billion years or 10 billion years or 15 billion years, or if science decides to change their mind and say 50 billion years, it could also work, right? It just means one very long period. Now, this is not the most common approach to it, but I'm just sharing you one approach, which is that day 1 doesn't mean it was a day 24 hours. It could be however long you want it to be, okay? Now, this could be one of those interpretations that is trying to make science happy, but again, he is actually quoting from the Midrash. Now, day 4, a 4th approach. Ready for the 4th approach, everyone? The 4th approach is that the whole story of Bereshit, the whole story of creation is just basically a secret. It's basically, we don't even understand it. We're reading words. We're saying the sun and the moon created and the stars and the heavens and the firmament and the land and the water, and he split the water between the top water and the bottom water. Because these are all just secrets of the universe we're never going to understand, right? And he might even take it further and say it's just an illusion, just a parable. In other words, we know God created the world, and all the 6 days are just sort of these deeper, secretive parables to something of the universe that teach us morals. And we actually do know that we learn a lot from the creation of the world, right? We learn a lot of things from the sun and the moon. There's a story about that originally the sun and the moon were actually equal. They were equal bodies. This doesn't agree with science. I'm just telling you a midrash, Jeff. They were equal bodies, and the moon and the sun said, hang on a second, there's no room in this world to have 2 rulers, right? You can't have 2 Queen Elizabeths and two kings and queens, right? It doesn't work that way. One of us has to go. So God says, okay, moon, because you suggested the idea, you can be smaller, and the sun, you can be bigger. Okay, it's just a midrash, doesn't mean it actually happened, but it just shows you that a lot of the things in are just allegories or just illusions or parables. And that's Rabbi Cook's opinion, who's a modern day rabbi in 1905. Okay, now the next one is Rabbi Schroeder, and I'm going to skip this one because I want to come back to Rabbi Schroeder. But he does say something interesting, and I'll tell you in a second what he says, and that is that even using today's modern day thinking about the world, for example, the Bronze Age, right? When was the Bronze Age? It was about 4,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. The Bronze Age actually connects nicely with Tuval Cain, who was one of Noah's descendants, who was one of the first ones in the Bible to actually form a metal object or a copper object, right? So the Bronze Age actually connects nicely, or the modern day sort of human beings connect nicely to the Bible. But we'll talk about Schroeder in a second. I want to come back to it because I want to spend a bit of time on him. The final reconciliation is from a Kabbalist. He talks about the fact that when the world was created, in fact, we were just in one of the 50-year cycles, and the world was actually 42,000 years old when Adam and Eve were created. So the world wasn't zero at the time it was created. The world was actually 42,000 years old. Now, he goes on something interesting. Now, this is written, by the way, in the year 1305. Now, in the year 1305, this was way before we knew the world was 15 billion years old, right? This is what he wrote. This is from a Kabbalist in Segovia in Spain. He lived in Italy in 1305, and he wrote this. He wrote, right, Jeff, this is before your textbook started telling you the world's 15 billion years old. He wrote in his commentary that the world is 15 billion years old, right? I know, Jeff, now it's 13 billion, but he wrote 15 billion. And how did he get that? He says there's a difference between God years and human years, right? There were divine years and human years. And what he said was that in Psalms it says that in God's eyes, 1,000 years are like as yesterday. So we actually say this at funerals. We say this in our Psalms. We say that, in God, in other words, we're just like a passing, a flower that flies over the field, right? But in God's years, one of our days is like 1,000 years, right? And there's jokes about the rabbis saying their pulpit as well. But he says if you base it, and we just say that's more like a parable. Like, in other words, we don't understand the movement of time. If something goes wrong in our life, we don't understand the beginning and end of it. We just see our little, we just say, it's terrible about this virus, but hopefully there'll be good things that come out of it down the track. But he was saying that he took it literally. He said, actually, in God's years, 1,000 years is like one day. And he divided his Kabbalistic interpretation of 42,000 years and said, actually, the world is 15 billion years old. This is written in 1305, right? Way before we could radiate rocks and tell us how old it was. Yeah, so this is actually...
He's about 1,000 times out, that's all. I'll tell you later.
Okay, but the point is, Jeff, he didn't say it's 5,000 years old. He said billions. Okay,
no, I know, but he's still 1,000 times out. I'll explain later.
Okay, all right, no problem. But he's closer than we thought he was. What my point was that we had a lot of these approaches before science told us what our thinking should be. So before, Jeff, you went to uni, we had already been thinking about how the universe existed. And finally, there's this other one, which is basically that Adam and Eve were actually the 26th generation of other people. So in other words, there were other generations before Adam and Eve. And in fact, he was the 26th, Moses was 26th generation from Adam, but there were 974 generations before that. Now, that doesn't mean there were human beings before that. There were obviously prehistoric creatures. What's the difference between Adam and these prehistoric people? The difference is that we have free will. When God created Adam, he gave him free will to decide good or bad. And we know that's the tree of knowledge and all that type of thing. So I've just shared with you 5 or 6 different interpretations of, I guess, how to reconcile 13 billion and 5,000. I now want to share with you Dr. Jarrod Schroeder. Now, I'll share with you some articles later that you can read yourself, because I'm going to give you a 10-minute version of his mathematics and his scientific thinking. But I found this quite interesting. And he is actually, there's a yeshiva in Israel called Aish Torah. Now, Aish Torah it's an outreach organization. In other words, anybody at any level of knowledge can go to Aish Torah and study. And what's good about Aish Torah is they don't just give rabbis like me just saying, this is what the Torah says, right? This is what the Torah says, believe it or don't believe it, right? They actually bring doctors and scientists and medical people and people from all different backgrounds that teach you the Torah and the science. So when people like our scientists on the call today have questions, I don't say, I don't know. I don't understand the science. You actually have Dr. Schroeder telling you the science behind it. So that's what's good about Aish Torah. You can go and there's called a discovery program where they give you like the whole Judaism in 24 hours. And they give you a free lunch as well, which gets people in. So obviously, whatever helps. If you like the science, you like the free lunch, you go along and you learn a lot. So I did actually once attend one of these seminars and it was absolutely brilliant. So Jarrod Schroeder, who's pretty famous, you can Google him after. He's still alive. He's a modern day scientist. He was a nuclear physicist at MIT. Now, I don't know the difference between nuclear physicist and molecular physicist. I don't know the difference, but he's smarter than me. I know that, right? Smarter than me. Now, he says when he explains his version of creation and his version of the science, he says he does two things. Firstly, when he looks at the science, he doesn't go to Google and Wikipedia and look up the science. He says he only uses science that has been peer reviewed, right? So only from Harvard or MIT or I don't know where, Jeff, whatever your university you're from, or Judy, I don't know. He only uses articles that have written by people that know what they're doing and they've been peer reviewed. So he doesn't make up the science. He doesn't find some scientist that agrees with him. He uses peer reviewed scientists. Secondly, he doesn't use any modern day Torah commentators. So when he looks at the modern day commentators, he looks at the Torah, he looks at Rashi, he looks at Maimonides, he looks at Nachmanides, right? From 1500 years ago. So he doesn't use any modern commentators that try to bend Torah interpretation to modern science. He uses commentators that existed before we had the science. So basically he says, and the way he starts off his talk, and it's actually quite brilliant. He says, in 1959, there was a survey of scientists and they said, what do you believe is the beginning of the universe? How old do you think the universe is? When was it created? And in 1959, the majority of scientists says, what do you mean it was created? It always existed. There was no creation, right? Come forward 10 years later to 1965 and you talk about Hubble and you talk about the scientists of the Big Bang Theory, suddenly they realized that the world was created from something, right? Now, it could be the Big Bang. Doesn't matter what we're talking about. The fact is, suddenly 10 years later, the scientists already are talking about creation. They're not talking about God, right? You never hear a scientist say God, right? Because day one of science in university, they say, don't mention God in our science classes, right? But they know there's something deep down happened, right? They know something happened. So he's already saying that science already moved in modern day to something more similar along the lines of the Bible, which was God created the world. They won't say God, but they'll say it was created, what didn't always exist. Secondly, we talk about how old is the universe. Now, Nachmanides is one of the most deepest commentators on this area. And he goes through the Genesis and the discussion and explains it in a very interesting detail. And Nachmanides tells us, way before science told us this, that we actually have two calendars. We have 5,781, which the JNF tells us is the year, you get the JNF calendar, and it says on the top 5,781, right? And the other calendar is the 6 days of creation. Because the JNF calendar, our calendar, right, starts from creation of Adam, which happened on day 6. So on Rosh Hashanah, which we celebrate the birthday of the world, right? Everyone know the song, Hayom Harat Olam, right? Know that one from Shule? That's a Sekula Shul tune, isn't it? Hayom Harat Olam, right? Hayom Harat Olam, after we blow the shofar, we say Hayom Harat Olam. This is the birthday of the world. Now, not the birthday of the universe, the birthday of the world. And we count that from Adam. That's when Adam was created on day 6. In fact, in our own minds, there's actually 3 creations that occurred in our history. The first creation was heavens and earth. The second creation was animals. And the third creation was Adam, human, what we are today. We count 5,781 from Adam. So So I'm just looking at my notes here. The other thing to remember is the whole creation of the world, the whole discussion in the Torah is 31 verses long, 31 verses. If you go to, Jeff, what university did you go to? I don't know. Did you go to Monash, Melbourne? Monash University. If you go to their library and you look up books about the universe, they probably have 10,000 books, right? In Harvard, there's probably 20,000 books about the creation of the world. We only have 31 verses. So obviously not every detail of creation is going to be written down, right? Obviously the 31 verses is written in a very summary form. There's probably deeper meanings behind it. The Ramban actually talks about it in a deeper sense. Now, we also know from the Talmud that it tells us that the whole creation was only written in a very summary form. There's a deeper subtext. There's a much more deeper explanation and reason behind the creation of the world. And it's only just a parable. And I guess what we're saying is that even I guess in the old times, we thought that when the sun rose every day and the moon came out at night, we thought that the earth was a center and the sun went around the moon, sun went around the earth, and woke up every morning, came back. Only later did we realize that it was all relative. And in fact, we're walking around the sun, right? We're all in gravity or in rotation of the sun. So it's all about perspective. It's all about how you look at things. From our perspective, the sun's moving around us. But when you step out of the shoes of our earth and look in the bigger universe, in fact, it's actually us going around the sun. So it's all about how you look at the world. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu, and I'm just going to share with you my screen again, if I can do that easily. There are many verses in the Torah that need a bit of explanation. So I'm just showing you my screen. So I just pulled out a few of them just to show you. So I'll just skip that one for a second. Did I not pull it out for you? I did not pull it out for you. Sorry, just let me look if I can pull it out. No. Yeah, here we go. On Moses' last day when he was born, Moshe says, Zechor Yemot Olam. This is in V'zot HaBracha, the last parsha of the Torah. He says, remember the days of old, consider the years of ages past. Well, what's he saying? What's he reminiscing there? Moses is about to die. And he tells us, remember the days of old and consider the years of the ages past. Now, Moses wasn't just a poet. I mean, he was a poet who was a great man, but every word he said meant something. The Nachmanides, Ramban tells us that, in fact, he's talking about the two calendars. He says, remember the days of old is actually the 6 days of creation, and consider the years of ages past is actually the current calendar, 5,780 years old. So he's actually telling us that Moshe is telling us there are actually two calendars, right? Think about how the world was created. Now, all right. So this is what Schroeder's saying, that there's two calendars. One's 6 days, right? Our 6 days, and one is 5,700. Now, the other thing I'll just copy it out here, also Bereshit. Let's have a look. I'll show you some interesting wordings about Bereshit. What's the time? Okay, we've got 10 minutes. Perfect. Bereshit bara Elokim et Hashem. When God created the heavens and the earth was unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the water. So you can imagine the world was unformed and void. There was darkness over the surface of the deep, whatever that means. We don't even know what this means, right? And a wind from God sweeping over the water. And then he said, let there be light, and there was light. We all know that one, right? Let there be light, there was light. God said, here we go. God saw the light that was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. And he called the light day and the darkness night. By the way, the sun and the moon weren't created at this point, by the way. And there was evening, there was morning, day one. Now, this is actually the wrong translation. It says here a first day. All English, or a lot of English Bibles get this wrong, right? Wasn't the first day, it said Yom Echad. What does Echad mean? One. It didn't say the first day, it said day one. It's a big difference. First day means first, second, third, fourth. Here he's saying day one. Now, the Ramban, our commentator, said actually, I'll tell you a few interesting things about these words. Firstly, he says here, the word choshech. It says here, there was darkness over the surface of the earth. And then it says the word choshech again, and it says he separated the light from the dark. And the Ramban says that actually the word choshech here, this is actually darkness in terms of darkness. Like you turn off the light, it's dark. turn on the lights, it's not dark anymore. He says the choshech here, the darkness here, is not the same darkness here. When he said the darkness was hovering over the deep, he says that was actually something which he called in Hebrew black matter, not Black Lives Matter, more like dark matter. Is that a scientific concept, by the way? Dark matter, right? I think they call it dark matter now. He's in his Hebrew words, he says it's dark matter, and he says, by the way, these are his words. He says that the dark matter was something that was very, very thin, very, very thin, and it wasn't really a substance. It was very thin, not really a substance. It was a substance, but not really a substance. He says it had like something tangible, but it wasn't really tangible. Now, in science, what's tangible but not really tangible? What's there but not really there? One interpretation could be energy, right? You can't touch energy. It doesn't really exist, but it's there, right? So perhaps the Ramban, in his own words, was saying, actually, in the beginning, this choshech was actually something very thin, maybe something like the Big Bang, maybe, that was very thin, that had it didn't really exist. There was no substance. And maybe that we're talking about there at the Big Bang. In other words, there was something that was just a ball of energy. Now, I think, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, or Judy, the Big Bang was just a ball of energy, right? Is that what they're saying? Right. So the Ramban, way before the Big Bang theorists came about, was actually talking about, in Hebrew, obviously, he said that this choshech was dark matter, right? That was very thin, right? He says very thin. He says how thin? He says even smaller than the thin of a kernel, right? Tiny, tiny thin that really you couldn't really touch it, okay? For the moment, let's call it the Big Bang. I don't know. I have no better word for it. Now, he also brings something else interesting. He says that when it says Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, it was evening and the morning. He says this could not be that the sun went down, the sun came up, and it was morning, because the sun did not exist on day one, right? We know that. By the way, if the Torah was written by man, right, they wouldn't have made a silly mistake, right? You'd think they would have checked that if they had morning and evening, you had the sun and the moon. So God purposely put the sun and the moon on day 4. So what does he say evening and morning are? He says the word Erev doesn't mean evening. It means chaos. Boker, so Erev, by the way, means a mixture. What's a mixture? Chaos. And what's Boker? Boker in Hebrew can also mean clarity. In other words, there was a mixture, there was chaos, and there was clarity, and here comes day 1, right? In other words, the world was not nothing, it was just in chaos. And God created an orderly world, right? He put nature in the world. So Erev and Voker doesn't mean day and night, it means there was chaos. And that's why why evening comes before morning. Because evening doesn't mean evening, it means chaos. And then there was morning. Imagine we said there was morning, then evening, wouldn't work, right? The interpretation is evening, chaos, morning, orderly, day 1. So if you put a few of these interpretations together, and this is what Schroeder did, he says, okay, so we've got the Ramban, the Rahmanides, 1,500 years ago, before the Big Bang Theory, by the way, saying that we've got this choshech, this dark matter, that was very thin, that was basically a ball of energy, right? And there was chaos in the world, and Hashem created order. Now, the Ramban tells you something else, and I'll just share this with you, and I'm going to finish off because I want to bring it back to what Schroeder was saying. The Ramban also says, by the way, that now the Ramban, by the way, I don't think he was a scientist. I think he was an actual rabbi, but he brings here. Oh, by the way, this is the Ramban. If you want to look at it, no, here. This is the Sefaria, the Ramban. See, I'm not making this up. He talks here about the fact that time was only created on day 1. So when that ball of energy existed, right? When the ball of energy existed, there was no time. And in fact, and only when the world sort of formed into matter, and I think this works with science, correct me if I'm wrong, you can't have time on energy, right? There's no time on light. Time only works on matter. And he's saying time was created after that initial energy happened. So Vayera Evoka means Hashem created time. Time was created after that ball of energy. So what he could be saying, and I'm just stretching this very big, but an interpretation is the Big Bang Theory was possible because maybe when Hashem created that initial ball of energy, it was really just this sort of ball of energy that exploded into the world, and then time only came later. Now, that doesn't explain why the world is 15 billion years old. That just explains the fact that there are different ways of interpreting how the Big Bang could have worked. By the way, I'm not justifying the Big Bang, Jeff. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is just a way to say that the Big Bang can actually work with the Torah's perspective, and it's not really incorrect. But just to finish off Schroeder, and you can look at this later, and I can send you the article if you want. I can put in the message, or you can email me. Schroeder was actually saying that we know that time, that light is beyond time. Light speed doesn't work with time. But what Einstein told us was actually that time is different relative to different parts. In other words, this is my very simple understanding of Einstein. He's saying that if you look at a train going past you, it goes 40 k's an hour, right? But if you're on a train going 20 k's an hour and the other train's going 40 k's an hour the other way, the train's only moving 20 k's an hour relative to you. And that explains also why when you're on a train, you don't feel the train moving. You can drink a cup of water, right? You can't drink a cup of water at 40 k's an hour, but you can on the train because it's basically still. And I think it also explains why when you're sitting at a train station and the other train moves, you think you're moving as well. I think that's why. Always confuses me when I'm coming home from work. So, but Einstein also said, and Jeff and Judy, please jump in if I'm wrong, but he also said that time is different on the moon and on the sun. Time is slower on the moon, faster on the sun. In the universe, because the universe is expanding at different time rates, time is actually different in different places of the universe. And is that right, by the way? Like a clock on the moon will be slower?
Could be.
Okay. So in other words, time is different as you go beyond.
You can't go there to check it because when you come back, it'll be on your regular time again.
Correct. But you can watch the movie Interstellar with Brad Pitt, I think, and he tells you that if you go to the moon or wherever he was, a different planet, and he came back, everyone was 100 years old and he's only a day older. So it does work on the movie, right?
Another religious scientific scholar.
Brad Pitt or Einstein. But the fact is, we know the Earth is expanding, and what Schroeder's, and this is my interpretation of Schroeder. So this is my very simple, non-scientific explanation. He says that if you had lived at the beginning of creation, right, whenever that was, and every second you sent out a light pulse, right, to the future generations, right, and this is how they measure the age of the universe. Every second you send a light pulse. Second later, a light pulse. Second later, a light pulse, right? From where you were sending that light pulse from, it's only a second difference. But when we receive that, because the world is expanding, we would actually get that light pulse longer and longer each time. So in other words, the first light pulse will be 8 minutes away, then it'll be 16 minutes away, then it'll be a year away, then it'll be 5,000 years away, then 10 billion years away, right? It goes on and on and on. Because as the world expands, so does the distance it takes for you to get it. And that's how we can tell how big the universe is, because the Hubble telescope looked down and says, oh, look, we're expanding away from each other. And because we're so far away, that's how we know how long we are. In my terms, someone explained it's like looking at raisin dough that turns into raisin bread. We know that the raisins, when the dough rises, the raisins get further and further apart from each other. And that's how time works as well, or the universe works as well. So all Schroeder was saying, I'm going to say this in 1 minute, but if you want to look into it, you can read his article because it's way smarter than I am. All he's saying is that when we look back from today, when we say the world is 15 billion years old, we are using our clocks, looking back in time to the beginning of the world, and we say, oh, it's 15 billion years old. But when God created the world, he was looking forward. He was saying the world was created in 6 days, right? And then he sent it out into the universe. And then when we look back at it, it looks like it's 15 billion years old. Now, just before you think I'm crazy, Schroeder actually does some calculations because he says we know the speed at which the world is expanding. I think he said it's 12 to the 1 to the power of 12, or 1 with 12 zeros after it per second, whatever that means. And basically, he calculates backwards and he says the world was created in 6 days, right? Our sages tell us the world was created in 6 24-hour periods. It is true, 6 24-hour periods. But those 24-hour periods was how God looked at it when he created the world. But when we look back it actually looks like 15 billion years. In other words, just because God looks at the world in 24-hour periods, when we look back, it looks like 15 billion years to us. In other words, time is relative. So when we say the world is 15 billion years old, we're actually looking back in time to the beginning of creation from our perspective. Now, he's got maths there, and I'll share the article with you. You can read it. But he uses scientific methods like Einstein and Hubble, and he basically tells us that time is relative. And therefore, to say that the world is 15 billion years old is not in contradiction to our Torah. So just to summarize, our calendar is made up of two parts, 5,700 years from the date Adam was born and the 6 days of creation. And there are many approaches to how you look at those 6 days. I shared 6 of them with you. None of them are wrong. They all could be right. It doesn't matter. For our purposes, not going to change the way we think about God. We still think God created the world. But it just shows you that just because science tells you one thing, it doesn't mean that we have to throw out religion. We can make it align, and even if it doesn't align, it doesn't matter because we still believe in our Torah. So if suddenly next year science changes, we're not going to go and reinterpret the Torah. We're still going to use our commentaries that say the world was created in 6 24-hour periods. All we're saying is from God's perspective, not from ours. So I'm just going to stop sharing and stop a video.